Hello, TestJS Summit. I'm Gleb Bahmutov, Senior Director of Engineering at Mercari US. With me is my friend Roman Sandler. Roman, how are you?
I'm great, Gleb. Hey, everyone. Good to be here.
And we wanted to tell you about testing pyramids and how we think it makes little sense to just use a single testing pyramid. We also will tell you what to use instead. So if everyone is ready, these are the topics we want to cover in our presentation. We'll talk about the common misconception where the speed matters, but which speed to measure. We'll talk about a replacement for testing pyramid that is called testing metrics that Roman came up, and we'll talk about how to apply it in your development lifecycle. If we have questions, we'll answer them at the end. Roman, you want to take it away?
Absolutely, Gleb. So I think the first point is the original testing pyramid that we're all familiar with, and I think it was the term was coined and introduced to the world by Mike Cohen in his book Succeeding with Agile. Yeah. And essentially the idea is that all of your automated tests should be divided into three parts: unit test, service test, and UI test. The biggest part should be unit test, then service test, and then unit test. And this idea is based on the premise that unit tests are essentially very, very fast and cheap.
Right.
And the higher level the tests become, the slower they are, and more expensive they are to write. Right. And many. After this idea was introduced into the world, each community really took it and made modifications and applied it to their own domain, to their own realm. But essentially, the core idea remains, right? Higher level tests equals more integration, slow and expensive, and lower level tests equal more isolation, fast and cheap.
Right.
And with time, this idea became started to get challenged. And I think like the most interesting and recent example of this is actually the testing pyramid introduced by Ken C. Dodds at AssertJS in 2018, where basically he says, like, instead of having unit tests as the core, right, of your pyramid or like shape, right, or your being the biggest part of your test suite, it should be integration tests, right? Mm-hmm. And that's basically based on the idea that like integration tests are somewhere balanced, right, in terms of like how fast and cheap they are, and what you get. And when you get, from them, essentially. So I think there's a really good quote from Guillermo Rauch from Vercel that goes, write tests, not too many, mostly integration. And I think that like that quote is, it's very, very popular. And I think it sort of summarizes the, probably the prevalent approach to testing, especially in the React community. And I think it really, it really sums it up nicely where you say, like, instead of having a bunch of, have many, small unit tests, let's have less integration tests, but still, keep the same idea, essentially.
Right. Roman, I was at that conference, AssertJS, and I actually had my version of testing pyramid, right? Where I also replaced some of the unit tests with static types, linters, using libraries, and some of end-to-end tests with crash reporting. So we're all replacing parts of a pyramid with different things.
Absolutely. So there are many different implementation, and like you said, Gleb, this is yours, and I think like it has some of the same ideas, right?
Yeah.
And if we look at really the differences, I would say that what is different essentially is that most of your tests should be integration tests, right? Instead of unit tests. That's like the biggest idea. That's like the biggest change from the original testing pyramid, right?
Right.
But I think more interesting is like what is the same. And from my perspective, the same thing about them, right, is still this core idea, still this paradigm that higher level tests are slower and more expensive, right?
Yeah.
And this and a good example of this is that still end-to-end tests, both with the original testing pyramid and the testing trophy, they still get a very, very small part, essentially like the smallest part, just like the tip of the pyramid. And I think that comes from the same idea, essentially.
Yeah.
Right. So, the main message of the testing trophy is compromise on effort to gain more confidence, right? But it still accepts the idea that the higher level the test is, the more effort it requires, right?
Right.
And same for lower level tests, right? Lower level tests require small effort, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Higher level tests require a large effort. Well, I think, right, that it mostly depends.
Yes.
I know that's a very annoying answer, right? That's like a very, it's something that we don't like to hear because we just want to get like the answer. We want a definitive answer. But unfortunately, I think that giving any definitive answer on this question might be misleading and essentially not true. So how about we re-examine, right, this idea, this truth that lower level means fast and cheap, higher level means slow and expensive. How about you take it away, Gleb?
And I think when people say low levels are very fast and cheap, right, we really talk about just running speed, right, the seconds. And they don't actually look at the efforts the tests take, right? They only talk about running tests and they compare this bar. And I've seen it again and again where people say this tool is better because it's faster, right? It executes in 4 seconds or 2 seconds versus 8 seconds. And to me, this is a huge red flag because what's missing in this comparison? Well, it's missing how long does it take to install and start using the tool, both locally and on CI, right? How much effort do you need? How much effort do you need to actually write a test, a useful test that gives you any kind of confidence? How much effort do you spend to actually debug a test that fails on CI? Like nobody compares those costs or efforts, right? And finally, the maintenance cost, which is the biggest part of writing any test that live with your code, will probably be the maintenance of them when the person who've written them has left the company. So how do you compare those two? So to me, how fast you can do the installation of a tool, how fast you write the test, mostly comes from how good the documentation for the tool is, and if you have good previous experience with a tool, right? That's what determines how fast and how much effort it requires. The running test to me is only determined by how well you set up your CI. Do you cache dependencies? Do you parallelize your tests so they run in parallel or not? That's the main factor. Now, the debugging test and how much effort it requires to maintain them, that's where the tools, the framework itself, right? The test runner, that's where it distinguishes itself. That's the main thing that the tool itself can bring to the table aside from documentation. So let me give you a couple of examples. If we use those effort bars, if you don't write any tests, you don't pay any premium on all 4 bars except for maintenance. In the long run, you'll have to maintain your code and it will be very painful. Now, if you have just manual tests, well, there is nothing to install, nothing to write, but then the running test manually becomes the dominant factor. Let's say you use something like Jest and Enzyme. Well, it's easy to start writing unit tests. It's easy to install and run them. but debugging and maintaining them becomes a pain because a lot of those tests will be tied to implementation. If you replace enzyme with React testing library, the maintenance becomes simpler because your tests are not tied to implementation, right? But debugging is still a problem because you're trying to debug something that usually is meant to run in a browser from the terminal. Now, let's say you use Jest Snapshots. In that case, debugging tests is easier because you have more context to each failure. But maintaining the test becomes a problem. And more often than not, you just say, yeah, just approve this giant snapshot, just replace the existing one. Let's say you use visual snapshots where you take an image diff of entire page or a component. Well, that means the debugging a failing test is much simpler. You see what has changed on the page, right? Maintenance becomes simpler because you can just accept a changed snapshot or not. You know what it means. But then writing the test and running them becomes slightly slower and requires more effort because you have to set up the whole visual testing pipeline. You have to learn how to write visual tests. So it's always a trade-off. Now, I'm partial to Cypress Test Runner because I worked on Cypress for a while. And I think, yes, running the test using a real browser that loads the real application that have built-in retries and waits requires more time per seconds, but debugging the tests and maintaining them becomes so much simpler because each test failure produces a screenshot. You have a full video of a test run. You can compare it to the previously successful test run, so you can understand where things diverged. But running tests, yes, will take a couple seconds longer, but the other two bars will become much shorter. Now, Roman, I have no comment on this slide. I'm glad you put it in, but people will disagree with you and they'll let you know. I'm just telling you right now.
Absolutely.
But even no code testing solutions, right? But right now promise the world or the moon to many testers and developers like MABL. Now, there is no installation. You just record your test. You have to know how to record the test and click around. Everything becomes simple except for maintenance. I found from our experience right now that MABL tests are very hard to maintain because any change in the application requires re-recording the test, right? So you'll pay a huge penalty in the maintenance bar rather than in running the test or installation. So every tool is not a simple faster or slower, but you have to compare it in multiple dimensions in the effort, right? So all the testing pyramid advice is a little bit problematic, isn't it, Roman?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that probably the reason why we talk mostly about the time it takes to run a test, because that's probably the only thing that is actually quantifiable.
Yes.
With like hard numbers, right? You can just run it and show a screenshot like you showed where, this takes 1 second, this takes, 5 minutes. That's obviously better, right? And it's very hard to quantify, right? The total, let's call this like the compound, right? Effort metric. It's very hard to quantify how much time it takes to write tests, to debug, to maintain. It's also something that you potentially notice over time, right?
Yes.
And not right away in this like specific PR, right?
Right.
So it does make sense that people tend to use the metric of like running tests. But I think that if you zoom out for a second and you look at the whole picture, especially over time, you see that this idea of like what you put into a test suite, it doesn't end. It doesn't end. It might start with, running the tests the first time, but it definitely doesn't end there. Yes. Right? There's a whole slew of things that you need to consider. And we enumerated some of them right here, but essentially there are many, many things that you need to consider when you when you try and quantify like the effort that you put into your testing suite, right? So I would say that any testing level recipe, and but what I mean by recipe is that some prescription like a pyramid or like the trophy where they say, some percentage, right? Some number, some hard number, like 70% of your test suite needs to be unit tests or something or integration tests or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Any prescription like that has two problems. And the first one is they lack context, right?
Yeah.
They're not specific to a situation. They're sort of like, like a rule of thumb, essentially. And I think I would say that a lot of times they miss by a long shot, right? Because it really depends on the team you have, what tools are they familiar with, what's the feature that you're working on, right?
Yeah.
And on and on and on. And we showed some of the things that, this whole, like the effort part really depends on, right? So they lack context, and that's a big problem. And the second thing is they become a dogma. And to me, this is really a big one because, this thing really makes it harder for us as a community, as an industry, to like have true, like, true introspective and a true conversation about, how to do things, right? Because it's much easier to subscribe to this, structure, to this subscription, right? Just prescription of like, you should have 70% unit tests. It's much easier to just follow that road.
Yeah.
But I think it makes us, it creates stagnation, and it makes us potentially, in some cases, make the wrong choice just because, we're used to something and, we follow this rule. So I came up with this idea, right? And this really came from me, working in the industry and having a lot of conversations with engineers about this topic, and noticing that a lot of people really believe this idea of the testing pyramid, right? But without really digging deep into it. So I would like to suggest a different model, right? A different way of considering what type of test to write. So this matrix essentially has two axes, right? One is confidence, one is effort. And each of them is split into 4 parts: small, medium, large, and extra large. And the idea is that you try and cross-reference between the amount of effort you put in and the confidence, you get, essentially, right? And the whole idea, the whole like premise of this tool is, optimize for maximum confidence at minimum effort, right? You wanna spend as little effort as possible and get back as much confidence as possible. That's what you want to strive for. It's not about a specific tool. It's not about a specific, level of abstraction in your test. It's about the idea, right? So we can run a bunch of examples on this matrix, but essentially think about, right, if you feel like you spent, let's say, large amount of effort on writing the tests, right, maintaining them, running them, whatever, you feel like you spend a large amount, right, of effort. But the confidence that you get, that you feel that you get, you have to put it on, if you had to give it a t-shirt size, if you give it like, let's say, medium. So if you cross-reference medium confidence with large effort, well, that puts you in the red. And to me, that should be like some, like a flashing red light bulb that you have a problem, right? Be it with the tool that you're using, be it with the process that you have in your company or whatever, right? But there is some problem, right? You want to change those odds where you have a higher level confidence, lower level effort.
Right.
Right, Gleb?
You want to be green. You don't want to be red.
Absolutely. You want to always, always be green. So go ahead, Gleb. Let's break this down.
Right. So how do you apply it? Well, you probably use a spiral model for software development. You plan a feature, you code it, deploy, maintain, and when you start planning, coding, deploying, the second feature, and so on. So you iterate a lot. So we suggest that you, at every step, ask yourself, how does this affect the testing? When you plan a feature, what do you have? What do you know for testing? What tools do you know, right? What tools does the team know, right? The interesting question is, what's the cost of a bug? If there is no cost of a bug, you might skip testing altogether and maybe have some manual tests. How important is for you to actually tie down the whole implementation? Or is it okay to test just the interface? Now, Roman, can you take us through the questions for the coding part?
Absolutely. So I think for me, this might sound a little silly or funny, but for me, I truly believe that you should enjoy right. You should enjoy testing, essentially, right? The whole part, be it writing the tests, running them, maintaining them, whatever. So I think it's really important to ask yourself, does it spark joy? Are you having fun? Right? And also on the other end of the spectrum, it's important to ask yourself what's painful about your process, about your tools, whatever. It's also important to ask yourself, how long does it take, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how long does it take? Like, if the feature takes you X days, and how much time does it take to write the test, or to test that feature in comparison?
Yeah.
And also, like, how much code is it? Like, how much code does it require to actually test your feature, right, in relation to the code for the feature itself? And also, right, is the test readable? Can, like, anybody on your team come into this test and be able to get a quick grasp of what you're trying to do there? So another spectrum of this whole idea is deploying, right? How scared are you to deploy? To me, if you're scared to deploy, if you feel anxiety when you hit that deploy button, right? It's a bit of an indication that there's a problem with your test suite, that you don't get enough confidence, right, from your test suite. And this whole idea is essentially about the confidence, right? Like Gleb showed us earlier, the bars that help you calculate the effort, right? And these questions might help you calculate the confidence, right?
Yes.
Like if you're scared to deploy, there's a problem. You probably don't have enough confidence from your test suite. Also, what do you test manually, right? I mean, if you're deploying and you find yourself testing a lot manually, although you have an automated test suite, also means that you probably don't really trust that test suite. What did you miss, right? Like, what actually became a bug, right, in your test suite just didn't catch? And did you go over budget, right? Like, did you did it take longer than you expected it to? Another thing is about maintenance, and I also consider this a part of confidence, right? How much flake do you accept, right? How flaky are your tests? If they're very, very flaky, you probably start trusting them at some point. Can the implementation change is another thing, right? Like, if every implementation change makes you change your tests, then I would say that, probably there's probably a problem with the confidence that your tests give you. And this is also, potentially like a funny one, but I think it's a real metric. If you look at a test that you wrote 6 months ago and you really hate it because it's, very, very specific or not flexible or not readable for whatever reason, I would say if you hate it, that's a good indication that you're not getting your money's worth, so to speak. Yeah.
And let me just quickly walk you, right? So first sprint, you might have just manual testing, and it's fine, right? As you develop more features, manual tests probably require a lot of effort, and you still can miss a lot of things. So maybe you bring some automation, right? Just to decrease amount of effort and buy some confidence. Maybe you concentrate on more tests in the next sprint to actually automate most of them. Maybe you look at different tools like visual testing, code coverage to increase the confidence from the test you already automated. So you use the testing matrix through your iterations to improve your confidence and lower the effort. Roman, take it away.
So in summary, you guys, there can't be a one size fits all, not at least from, in our opinion. It's hand wavy, right? It's not, it's misleading. Any solution that is like, provide some hard numbers and says, something like 70% of your test needs to be unit tests, or even, right, 70% of your test needs to be integration tests, right? To me is, it's not accurate, and it's actually, potentially not a good thing for you. The effort you put into your test suite must be worth the confidence it affords you. And I see this all the time, where people are just, hacking away at their tests, and they just like forget to take a step back and ask yourself, is this worth it? Like, is all the work I'm putting in right now actually worth what I'm getting back, right? I think that's like a very, very important question to be asking yourself. Is this worth it? And iterate, you guys. Revisit the decisions you made thus far and be critical of them, right? We have to question ourselves all the time. The perspective that we had 6 months ago is not the perspective that we have now. The tools we had 3 years ago are not the tools that we have now. The feature that we're working on is not the feature that we worked on, before. And, the conditions change all the time, and it might affect the approach you take to the test suite that you're writing, right? But you have to be willing to question yourself and put yourself out there, right? And potentially make changes, right? Yeah. I think it's critical. Don't be dogmatic, be pragmatic, right? I mean, try and think of everything on a case-by-case basis. There are no silver bullets, there are only trade-offs, right? And you want to make the best trade-off possible in that current situation at that point in time, right? And they have to be different things. They have to be different things between, one another.
Well, thank you for listening to us, and thank you, Roman. It was a pleasure doing this presentation with you.
Thank you so much, Gleb. Same here. It was really a treat.
Take care.